So the vessels were built in the shipyards upstream and floated downstream over a period of high tides, numerous high tides, often with men or oxen with ropes dragging them up the river from the bank. This was not easy. There were all these bends in the river. This was salt marsh they were trudging through. It could take a week to transport a ship down to the mouth to get out to sea. Astonished at the size of the crowd tonight. Thank you so much for coming out to hear about the North River, my favorite subject, perhaps. Unless you want to hear about my son. He just started college. No, I'm kidding. Okay. So, who here is an NSRWA member? Oh, thank you very much. Yay! Yay for you. All right. I could probably talk about this subject for 3 hours, but I'm going to keep it to an hour. I'm going to try really hard. There will be time for questions and comments at the end, but if you have a burning question that you need to ask, please get my attention. I'll try to answer it. Okay. So, some orientation to start. Here is a map of the North River. It rises from the confluence of Herring Brook and the Indian Head River, which is on the Hanover-Pembroke line, and then it flows northeast and then east to its outlet at the Atlantic. That's at Fourth Cliff and Scituate. A whole bunch of streams, ponds, and brooks in the towns of Pembroke, Hanover, Hanson, Norwell, Marshfield, and Scituate flow into it, feeding the river at various points along its course. Major tributaries. Can anybody shout one out? The Herring Brooks, yes. First, second, and third Herring Brooks. Anybody else?
Indian Head River.
Indian Head River, yes. Very good, South River. Yes, and the Herring River in Scituate. Those are all the major tributaries. They were not very creative when they named these, right? And that shows you how important herring were in the 1600s, for sure. This is a map of the watershed, the area which the rivers and their tributaries drain. It includes about 73,000 acres, or 114 square miles, primarily in Marshfield, Scituate, Norwell, Pembroke, Hanover, Hanson, Duxbury, and Rockland. And then to a lesser extent, Whitman, Abington, Weymouth, and Hingham, much lesser extent. The North and South Rivers are tidal to a large extent, and they include extensive acres of marshland. The rivers were formed when the glaciers retreated about 10,000 years ago. Basically, the glaciers melted, channels were formed in the meltwater. That became today's rivers. Silts deposited by the rivers soon became salt marshes, and as sea level rose, the marshes grew. We have a lot of marshes on the South Shore, especially in our watershed. The North and South Rivers Watershed Association acknowledges that the North and South Rivers and their watershed are located on the ancestral lands of the Massachusetts and Wampanoag tribes, the indigenous peoples who have inhabited the South Shores for thousands of years. We honor with gratitude the land, the waterways, and the people who have stewarded it for generations. There's ample evidence of Native American encampments at various sites along the rivers and their tributaries. Our watershed was mostly inhabited by the Massachusetts tribe, but the Wampanoag came here to hunt and fish seasonally as well. Their lifestyles were seasonal. They set up large camps inland in the colder months and smaller camps closer to the coast in the warmer months. Sadly, much of the local Native American population was decimated by a plague of smallpox in around 1617. But some were still living here in the 1630s when the European settlers came north from Plymouth. They were down in Plymouth for a while, then they came up here. The Indian Head River is located on the ancestral lands of the Matakeesit band of the Massachusetts people. Their region extended up and down the Indian Head and North Rivers and their tributaries. They established a village at what's now Pembroke around Furnace, Oldham, and Great Sandy Bottom Ponds. This actually is sometimes referred to in history books as the Great Ponds at Matakeesit. So that Matakeesit refers to that band of that tribe. Mataquisset means place of many fish. Prior to European colonization, our waterways flowed freely all the way from their headwaters to the ocean. Locally, we had river herring, shad, eel, brook trout, pickerel, perch, striped bass, and even salmon in our rivers in significant numbers. The indigenous inhabitants of our area lived in harmony with the ecosystem for thousands of years, using it for ceremonies, travel, and fishing. And they're still here today. It's important to know that. Dr. Larry Fisher of the Mataquisset tribe is an excellent resource. If you have an opportunity to hear him speak, he's fascinating. In many, but not all cases, the first colonial homesteads were established on our local rivers or near them. You have to remember that back then, there were some Native American pathways, but no roads. The oceans and the rivers really served as the highways. Starting in the 1630s, European settlers began arriving in today's Scituate and Marshfield. These included the so-called men of Kent in Scituate, who originally came from Kent, England, and began settling Scituate Harbor and Third Cliff back in 1628. Does anybody remember 1628? Governor Edward Winslow of Marshfield arrived in 1632. Robert and Lucy Barker arrived on Herring Brook in Pembroke around 1650. Cornet Robert Stetson, who I assume many of you are familiar with, and his wife Honor Tucker, arrived around 1634 and established a homestead at today's Stetson Meadows on the North River. Norwell was then Scituate, as I know you all know. The Stetsons were Norwell's first European settlers, and they had 9 children: Joseph, Benjamin, Thomas, Samuel, John, Eunice, Lois, Robert, and Timothy, in case you were wondering. Some of Cornet Robert Stetson's many accomplishments, and he really had quite a few in his long life, were in helping to set up the community and really the country as we know it today. He laid out roads and land grants. He laid out a footway from the upper meeting house at the North River in Scituate to his home, which is a long way. He served as the first constable for Scituate in 1643, probably the first. He served on the Plymouth Colony Council of War from 1651 to 1681. He served as a representative to the General Court of Plymouth Colony, and he lived on the North River. The first ferry across the North River was established in 1637. Does anybody know where? Anybody else? I heard a 3A. Yes, so it was William Vassall's Ferry at today's Route 3A on the Marshfield-Scituate line. It was also known as the New Harbor Ferry, and later it was known as Doggett's Ferry. The cost was a penny for an individual and 4 pence for a beast. Beasts are depicted in this picture. It probably started out just as a simple skiff, but eventually it was replaced by a square-ended scow, and that's what's shown here. By 1644, there were at least 3 ferries on the North River. Does anybody know where? So this one, 3A. Yes, Bridge Street, aka Union Street for us Marshfielders. And there's another. White's Ferry in Hummerock, which was then the North River. We'll talk more about that later. Okay, so the ferry at today's Route 3A was replaced in 1825 by Little's Bridge, which is depicted here. You recognize that scene? So this is heading north on 3A from Marshfield to Scituate. Looks a little different now. Rope Marine's over there. It was originally a toll bridge and a drawbridge. The toll was 8 cents for a single team of horses and 10 cents for a double team. So we're at 1825, so the rates have gone up. Local lores tell of 2 ministers, one from the Second Church of East Marshfield and one from the First Church of Scituate. They exchanged pulpits with some regularity, and on those occasions, they would meet early in the morning at the bridge where they would swap horses so they didn't have to pay the toll. Here at this bridge. I love that. recognize that? Yes, there's your Bridge Street, my Union Street. Beginning around 1644, Elisha Bisbee of Scituate operated a ferry at the site of today's Union Street Bridge. It was also known as the Upper Ferry. The lower one was Route 3A. Later, I would say like 1760, the Oakman family took over, and it was known as Oakman's Ferry. And you can actually see remains of this little ferry boat if you trudge into the marsh at super duper low tide. It's on the Norwell side. It's the second ditch from the bridge heading upstream, and there's some wooden remains of an old ferry boat. For years we thought it was an old salt hay and gundalo, but Paul McCarthy did some research, and it's an old ferry. Super cool. The first bridge at this site was constructed in 1801. It was a drawbridge, which was necessary to permit the passage of large vessels from the shipyards upriver. And then the toll keeper at that time had the best name ever for a toll keeper. Does anybody know what it was? It was John Tolman. I love that. Here's a bridge today, much less picturesque, but stronger. In 1850, when sufficient tolls had been collected to settle any remaining construction debts, they held a big jubilee, and crossing the bridge became free. That bridge was replaced in 1898 and then rebuilt again in 1917 after significant storm damage. A subsequent bridge was constructed in 1961 or maybe 1972. It was a drawbridge, but the draw didn't work. Today's bridge was constructed back in 2010. Another bridge existed only from 1871 to the 1940s. Does anybody know this spot? Yes, Damon's Point. So the Duxbury and Cohasset Railroad, which was later the Old Colony Railroad, traveled through Scituate and Marshfield and crossed the North River at Damon's Point. The train station up in Marshfield Hills was just down Summer Street, or down by Summer Street. The railroad bed actually ran along the course of today's Damon's Point Road. Some of the old trestle remains at the river, and you can look across the marshes and see where the railroad continued. There's still a railroad bed there. Fortunately, no train going over it. Building the bridge here at Damon's Point was a major challenge. The river seemed bottomless to the people doing the work. It was difficult to get the pilings in place and to get them to actually stay in place. There were a few iterations of the bridge here. The first was too low. The second had a removable section that allowed boats to pass, which was a real challenge to work. And the third was a drawbridge. They were all damaged by storms. Here's a picture of the salt marsh. By the mid to late 1600s, there were a significant number of settlements on or near the North River and its tributaries, especially the North River. The land beside it was good for farming, and the salt hay was harvested regularly. Salt hay was super valuable. Does anybody know what they used it for? Cattle, feeding their livestock, yes. They also used it for roof thatch and wall insulation. If they had to grow food for their livestock as well as themselves, they probably would not have survived here. Salt hay grew naturally, and it didn't need to be managed. It didn't need to be plowed or fertilized or weeded. It could just be harvested in its natural state, and it grew back every year. So it was super valuable. The towns apportioned the salt marshes. The owners dug ditches to set boundary lines and to facilitate the harvest and to drain the marshes to allow better grazing for their livestock. By the late 1600s, all the land grants to the marshes had been apportioned. This points to the value of salt marshes at that time. So other natural resources like the forests that were held in common, they were just held as common lands. They were not apportioned to the settlers. The marshes were. So this river shows the meandering river and the salt marshes. You can see some straight canals in the marshes. Those were probably man-made, mostly in the 20th century for mosquito control. But some of the ditches were created earlier. So that would have been for land boundaries or to create access for small boats called gundelows that were used in the harvesting of salt marsh hay. Here's a sketch of a gundelow from Anecdotes of the North River and South Shore. To harvest salt marsh hay, farmers sometimes fit their horses with meadow shoes. They were like snowshoes for horses. It gave them a little more footing on the salt marsh grass. But they mostly used gundelows, little boats that they could pole up and down the ditches to access the marsh. So that picture shows a gundelow in use. And this is a little harder to distinguish in this photo. This is from the collection of the Norwell Historical Society, by the way. But a gundelow is a large flat bottom boat up to 40 feet long, and it was able to carry 2 to 8 tons of hay, which is kind of crazy. The extensive use of gundelows led to increased ditching in the marshes and sometimes the widening of the creeks as well. Does anybody know what this is? So it's what's known as a corduroy road. This is on the North River in Norwell, downstream and across the river from Couch Beach in Marshfield. So it's just above Dwelly's Creek. The local historian Paul McCarthy has been researching this for a while. He says that a corduroy road is distinctly different from a landing or a wharf. Very likely it was used in the salt haying industry, kind of as a staging area for the transfer of the hay from the gundelows, or to the gundelows. Using 2-man hay poles, the workers would transfer the large stacks of hay from the gundelows and then bring them downstream to landings, and they'd be carted away from there. So you can see this at low tide. You can see it through the water at higher tides. You can kayak right up to it. It's a historical artifact. I don't recommend playing on it, but I did put a little body weight on it to see. It's very sturdy. It's crazy how long this thing has lasted. When it was built, it would have been above the high tide line. Now it's only visible at low tide. So the river environment has changed considerably in that time. Very likely there are more remnants of this elsewhere, maybe buried under the top level of the salt marsh. But look at how much growth of marsh is above that. Talking a little bit more about the value of salt marsh. This is just a close-up of that pretty cool thing. So in the early 1600s, the towns as we know them today didn't really have distinct boundaries. Land ownership was based on individual land grants. The colony waited until a settlement was large enough to need its own identity before they designated it a town. So in the early history of Scituate in particular, and this includes today's Norwell and Hanover, as well as part of Marshfield and Pembroke, we see a lot of jockeying for land rights, particularly around the salt marshes. So in 1636, Timothy Hatherley, who was one of the original land grantees of Scituate, lobbied for more arable land. Colony said, okay, go find some, but there's really no record of him accomplishing that. Then he got 15 planters to partner with him and lobbied again the following year. They were actually offered a large chunk of land between the North and South Rivers, so in Marshfield, but with conditions. They had to settle certain disputes first, and they had to establish a ferry at a certain spot. They did not meet these conditions. They continued to lobby, and then in 1640, they actually succeeded and received more land, 2 miles in length and 1 mile in breadth, on the easterly side of the North River. So this is what's known as the 2 Mile District. You've heard of this, some of you, yes? Okay. 2 miles is a section of Marshfield that extends south into what's now Pembroke. So the Marshfield is yellow up there, and the Pembroke is pink. In his 1831 History of Scituate, Samuel Dean found this noteworthy. He wrote, "The complaint of a want of room at so early a period seems singular to us, when now about 1/2 of the original territory of Scituate supports a population of between 3,000 and 4,000. He said, but we're to consider that at the time a peculiar value was placed upon the marshes, where forage was readily prepared for their cattle, and upon the lands near the river being the highway. So even by 1831, the marshes weren't quite so valuable. So all this fuss about 2 Mile was because of the salt marshes and the value of salt haying. Salt marshes don't carry the same financial value today, but they're immensely valuable ecologically. They're essential for flood control, especially during storms when they absorb all that extra flow. They provide wildlife habitat, which supports the food chain in general, and they help to keep rivers and the water supply clean. 2 Mile residents successfully petitioned to be annexed back to Marshfield in 1788. They thought it took a few tries, but it just made more sense because they wanted their town center to not be across the river. This is a packet ship. Rivers were the first highways, and so there was a lot of commerce around the rivers. According to an article by Joseph Chetwynd in Pembroke's really excellent new history book, it's not so new anymore, the North River was the main highway for the trading and commerce of goods, as there was no other system of transport to the town of Boston or to Plymouth over land. Wow. There was only one highway, the county road, and it was kind of a challenging trek, not easy. So packet ships traveled up and down the rivers buying and selling goods. Packet ships lines were established prior to 1670, and they were basically floating general stores. They thrived until the railroads came in the mid to late 1800s. So farmers would meet the packet ship on the North River and barter their homegrown vegetables and their dairy products for goods from China and the Mediterranean, like coffee and sugar and spices. Packet pilots also bought wood, fish, pot iron, charcoal from locals, and they sold them lumber and ship supplies, and there was a lot of commerce going on back and forth. It wasn't just the ships bringing things in. The settlers were selling their wares. Typical packet run up and down the river could take 3 or 4 days. There was a packet ship landing in Norwell. Does anybody know where? It was at Wanton Shipyard, later known as Foster's Landing. And there was also one at Bridge Street, Union Street. We're going to talk more about shipyards later. This is what remains of an actual packet landing on the North River. This is at Nelson Memorial Forest in Marshfield, viewed from the North River. So the ships would pull up. The ships were like 16 to 100 tons. The landings were like cribs of logs that were filled with rocks and then backfilled with gravel. And the idea was that they didn't extend very far out into the river so the ships could pull up easily beside them and it didn't block transportation for anybody else. This is best viewed from the water, and I highly recommend checking it out. In the 1800s, bridges replaced ferries. Does anybody know where this one is? Besides on the North River, like the caption says. Yes, Washington Street. So the first bridge over the North River was built in 1656 on the stage road from Boston to Plymouth. So today's Washington Street Bridge on the Hanover-Pembroke line. This is not how it looked then, but this is how it looked in the 1800s. It's been rebuilt many times. This is how it looks today. That's me. If you're paddling here, it can be an adventure. You really have to be mindful of the tides and the current. The water can move very swiftly. And if you're not going the way the water is going, it can get really interesting. The swiftness of the water, as viewed here, is what led to the establishment of mills on pretty much every tributary to the North River by the mid-1700s. So we had sawmills, grist mills, cloth mills, shingle mills, lumber mills, just to name a few. The very first mill to be established was around 1640 on First Herringbrook in Scituate. This was originally Isaac Stedman's sawmill. There were a lot more trees back then, and forests were a lot more diverse, so there was quite a bit more hardwood than there is today. Does anybody know what species dominates our forest today? Yes. Everybody knows the answer to that one. That makes me happy. It grows quickly, and it crowds out other trees that grow slower. So our forests were a lot more diverse when the European colonists arrived here and started cutting down the trees. By 1650, John Stockbridge had established a grist mill at this spot. You can still visit it today. The Scituate Historical Society has tours once or twice a year. This is Third Herring Brook. Other mills soon opened on this brook and Second Herring Brook in Norwell. In 1656, one of the first sawmills in the colony was erected by Cornet Robert Stetson, Timothy Hatherley, and Joseph Tilden on Third Herring Brook. It was on what they called the Old Indian Path, which was probably established by Native Americans long before any colonists arrived, but the colonists used it as well. That mill burned down during King Philip's War, and it was not replaced, but there was another one a half-mile downstream at this site, sometimes known as the Tiffany Mills, but it has kind of a long history. Prior to 1692, Sergeant Samuel Stetson became a partner in the enterprise, and mills at this spot continued in the Stetson family for a few generations, including 2 Jonah Stetsons. So for 100 years, I think it was known as Jonah's Mill. Later, it became a tack factory, and even later, it was known as the Tiffany Mill. The pond that powered the mill was there until 2016, sometimes called Tiffany Pond, sometimes called Tack Factory Pond. The factory buildings burned down in 1983. The land is owned by Cardinal Cushing Centers now, and we removed the dam in 2016. So this is not a great photo, and I apologize, but this is what the mill site looks like now. Dam removals help to restore the natural flow of streams, and they make communities more resilient to climate change. They also restore wildlife habitat, they enhance fish passage and migration range, and they improve water quality while eliminating liability for landowners. Most of the landowners are towns at this point. We've removed 3 dams on Third Herring Brook. This one, another behind the Y in 2014, and another behind where the mall cinema used to be in Hanover in 2020. And we're seeing brook trout populations rebound. We're seeing more herring. It's exciting. I would ask you to guess where this is, but there is a caption. Probably the first mill on the Indian Head River was at a spot called Ludden's Ford. There was a dam, a sawmill, and a grist mill here prior to 1693. Site is named for James Ludden, a local guide who, legend has it, literally carried Governor John Winthrop on his back across the river on his way to go visit Governor William Bradford in Plymouth Colony. So it was not an easy river to ford. Until recently, his name was recorded incorrectly as Ludham. All the signage still says Ludham, but someone did some good research and found that it was Ludden. So we'll see updates on those. Google will eventually catch up with us. It's not right on the Google map either. In addition to sawmills and grist mills, there were iron forges on the rivers. Bog iron was an important natural resource for the area. As early as 1704, Thomas Barden's ironworks was erected at Ludden's Ford. He transformed bog iron into iron utensils. So they would rake these iron ore out of the ponds and then run it through the forge and form it into all sorts of different things. So cool. I didn't know that's how it worked. The Curtis family took over this mill in 1791. This is the Curtis Anchor Forge. It produced up to 250 tons of anchors per year. 250 tons of anchors. They ranged from 1,000 to 10,000 pounds in weight. I'm trying to imagine how big a 10,000 pound anchor must be. Many of them were made for the government during the American Revolution. Some of the anchors for the USS Constitution were forged in Hanover, either here or at the Barstow Iron Works upstream. We're not sure. People are studying this. They're trying to figure this out. Later, small factories and foundries produced such goods as nails, tacks, cannonballs, shoes, trunks, and they all prospered on our rivers in the 18th and 19th centuries. This historic marker, which is on the bridge over the Indian Head River at Ludden's Ford, Lists a few of the industries that were established on either side of the river here, including a sawmill, an ironworks, a grist mill, a carding mill, and the Clap rubber mill. You can go check this out, but it's a little scary because it's still traffic going over that bridge at the same time, and there's not much of a shoulder, but it's pretty cool. This is the Clap rubber mill. That water there is the Indian Head River. You just take a second to contemplate the scale. In 1873, the E.H. Clap Rubber Works was established at the site of the old Curtis Anchor Forge. It was basically a rubber reclamation plant. Despite at least 2 major fires that required rebuilds, it ended up growing huge. In its time, it was the largest of its kind in the world, and it employed 100 people. Just to give you an idea of the scale of this place, if you know the park, I'm going to show you a picture of the park in a second, what it looks like today, but it's just mind-boggling to me. It was expanded in 1886 to both sides of the river. It was 18 acres of factory. There were 35 buildings until it went into receivership during the Depression. Barbara Barker, the Hanover historian, says that the waste was dumped in the riverside swamps and still remains today, somewhat overgrown, as an early trampoline and an early polluter. If you walk the trail on the Pembroke side through Ludden's Ford Park into the Tucker Preserve, it is kind of bouncy. It wasn't unusual in that time for the industries to use the rivers essentially as sewers to carry away their waste. Briggs' 1889 History of Shipbuilding on North River, he wrote, "The dams prevent their ascending to their old spawning grounds, the fish, and the refuse of the mills, especially the rubber mill, so impregnates the water and fills up the smaller streams that they cannot and will not go up. The fish will not go up. And without some decided steps are soon taken, all fish will become as much strangers to the river as the bass and salmon have already." So by 1889, bass and salmon were not seen on the rivers, and they were worried about what else was going to stop coming. Took us a while, but we got there. So this is looking south from Hanover to Pembroke. You can see the railroad tracks at the bottom here, and that brown bit there is the river held back by the dam. Here's a shot of the dam today. It was built, the most recent iteration was built in 1906, and it's been obsolete since 1934 when the factories closed. That's a fish ladder in the middle, that long extension. I went on a bounce beam out to the middle of the river to take this picture. It was fun. Can only do that in the summer. Since it's not going to be used again, we're hoping to remove this dam in the future. We're hoping to open up the Indian Head River and let the fish get up and downstream a lot more easily again. Dams not only impede the passage of fish that need to complete their life cycle by swimming upstream to spawn, they also create a thermal barrier for fish. Just a little map of the Indian Head above the dam there. When a river's impounded by a dam, it creates a large, shallow pool, a pond, essentially. And those tend to be warmer with lower oxygen levels. So you can see how the natural width of the river, so more natural up here, gets very wide as it approaches the dam. Due to the dams, the impoundments that hold the ponds in place, some of the waters in the Indian Head River have been measured up to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. This is not good for our native fish species who require cool, oxygen-rich water. So here's how the park looks today. No more factory buildings. There's some remnants, but Hanover purchased its side of the property in the 1930s. I'm not sure when Pembroke did. The fish ladder, not the dam, was constructed by the state around 1952. It's functional. It's difficult to access it, so we can't really tell exactly how many fish are using it. There is some use, for sure. The park itself became conservation land. So it was town-owned for a while, then it became actual conservation land in 62 or 63 and was cleaned up. And it looks a lot different now. Yay. This is the Waterman Tack Factory, another significant spot on the Indian Head. It's upstream from Ludden's Ford. A lot of different enterprises here, but we refer to it as Waterman. Waterman tacks were used primarily in shoemaking and repair, but also in the furniture and upholstery trades. They were also used for equestrian equipment and for laying out carpet. This was an exceptionally fine line of tacks. Waterman tacks were really the preferred tacks in many shoe repair shops, going as far away as New York and Philadelphia, right here on the Indian Head. More recent photos. So at some point between 1830 and 1870, the dam at this spot was raised. You can kind of see the dam, the remnants of the dam. There's chunks on the ground here, and then you can see it more on the building there. It was raised 4 to 5 feet somewhere in that span of time. It would have been as tall as the lower section of the factory building. I think in 1915 it was recorded as being 10 feet tall. So because of the dam there, the river upstream of this spot looked very different. It was more like a pond, and it was called Project Dale. Here's a postcard. John, you probably provided this postcard. Thank you. Project Dale while the dam was still in place. We think the name project refers to all the industries in the area, and Dale would refer to the peaceful valley that it was situated in. See the train tracks? In February of 1886, an unusually heavy rainstorm occurred. It damaged not only the tack factory, but the train tracks, and took out a whole bunch of other mills upstream. Subsequent storms in 1938 and 1954 did permanent damage to the industries throughout the river valley and basically destroyed this dam. This is Project Dale from the water level today. Well, not today, this year. It's so quiet now, it's hard to imagine it was once an industrial site. Such a beautiful spot. This is within the Tucker Preserve in Pembroke. The Hanover Branch Railroad was established in 1868 by an entrepreneur named E.Y. Perry. He had business interests up and down the Indian Head River. The railroad connected to a major north-south route in Abington, extended across Rockland. It had stations in West Hanover, South Hanover, and Hanover Four Corners. And there were 10 passenger trains going back and forth every day, plus freight trains in our quiet little burb. I just found this out. During World War I, there was talk of extending the Hanover Branch Railroad down the North River Valley to Greenbush. Fortunately, cars ascended and railroads did not, and we did not get that extension because that would have made for a very different North River Valley. Phew. This is how Project Dale looks today from the railroad level. So you can see the water level is considerably lower than it was in that old postcard. Has anybody walked on this trail along the Indian Head in Hanover? So great. Heading back to the North River. Does anybody know this spot? This was the Marshfield Historical Society. Everyone would raise their hand for this. This is the Hatch Mill, the last of many mills on 2 Mile Brook in Marshfield, which is a major tributary to the North River. 2 Mile Brook was dammed in 4 places, creating ponds that sometimes fueled 2 mills at a time. Grist mills, carding mills, fulling mills, sawmills, shingle mills, boxboard mills. Members of the Hatch family operated the Hatch Mill for over 150 years until 1965. This photo is from 1968, so shortly after it stopped functioning. The Hatch Mill, historic Hatch Mill Group manages it now as a historic site, and they have days every summer, like the last Sunday of the month throughout the summer, where you can go tour it. It's pretty cool. They've done a lot of structural and external repairs, saving the building from collapse, and now they're trying to re-mechanize the mill and restore the pond. We're not sure that's the best use of the stream. We'd maybe rather see the dam taken out, but history's important. We'll see what happens. Does anybody know what the North River was best known for? Wasn't milling. Of course you know. Yes, shipbuilding. The North River produced over 1,025 ships between 1650 and 1870 on almost every bend of the river where it touched firm ground. There was either a shipyard or a packet ship landing, sometimes both together. This is another historic plaque that you can tiptoe out to see if you're careful. This is on the old stone Washington Street Bridge, which spans the North River between Pembroke and Hanover. Many of the former shipyards are identified today by historic markers. These were erected in 1919 by the North River Historical Association. This is in Norwell on the North River in the Bark Hill neighborhood. That's recent. That's what it used to look like. Note the absence of trees. In shipbuilding days, there were no trees on this hill. That would have been the case up and down the North River Valley. What did they do with the trees? They turned them into ships. By the start of the 1800s, most of the trees had been cut down and they had not had a chance to grow back. So that's part of the reason why the shipbuilding industry waned. But before we get to that part, does anybody know any famous ships from the North River? Yes, yes, yes. The Beaver, who was involved in the Boston Tea Party. This is where the Beaver was constructed. This is Brick Kiln Shipyard in Pembroke on the North River. This is the Columbia, the first American ship to circumnavigate the globe. The Columbia River was named for this ship. The Columbia River forms the border between Oregon and Washington State. It's a huge river. It was named after this ship built on this little river here in our backyards. I just think that's the coolest thing. It was at least partially built at Briggs Shipyard at Hobart's Landing in Scituate. And just a sidebar here, it's really important to know that our local shipbuilding industry sometimes employed slave labor. At this particular shipyard, there was an enslaved man named Jemmy who worked in the shipyard. Boston and Newport were slave trading hubs. Some of the ships built on the North River were used in the slave trade. There's a great resource, I'm sure many of you know about it, the North River Early Black Heritage Trail. So much important information to read there. I recommend that. This is Wanton Shipyard today, also in Norwell on the North River. Edward Wanton built ships here from 1670 to 1707. He purchased the 80-acre farm in 1661, so he was there a while. Around 1795, the Wanton Shipyard was divided into two separate yards with the Foster family taking over the other side. And the Fosters built probably the most renowned ship from this shipyard, the Globe. Does anybody know why the Globe is famous? I heard mutiny. It was built in 1815. It was a successful whale ship. It was the first ship to bring 2,000 barrels of sperm oil into the United States. But there was also a gruesome mutiny on board in 1824 in the South Pacific. You can read all about it. There's this book called Demon of the Water by Gregory Gibson. It lays out all the truly gory details, but it's also fascinating and tells a lot about ships. Check that out. That big yellow arrow is the location of the Bald Hills Shipyard. You probably recognize this spot as where Route 3 crosses the North River. In 1674, Cornet Robert Stetson gave his second son, Benjamin, the Bald Hills for his home. The hill was probably bald at the time, but I don't know, maybe not. There was evidence of a Native American encampment there. 3 generations of Stetsons worked there, and later Nathaniel Church and 3 generations of the Michael Ford family all built ships at this spot. They mostly built small open boats known as shallops. They were about 30 feet in length. These were ideally suited for coastal travel, which was the best way to get around back then. And this is the Helen M. Foster, the last ship built on the North River at Chittenden Yard in Norwell in 1871. Okay, I see head shaking. Yes, there was another ship built on the North River, and there's a whole story about it. But I'm talking about the shipbuilding era. I'm not going to sidebar there. This was a 90-ton oak schooner. It was a major event when they launched it, drawing a big crowd, as you can see in the picture. So the vessels were built in the shipyards upstream and floated downstream over a period of high tides, numerous high tides, often with men or oxen with ropes dragging them up the river from the bank. This was not easy. There were all these bends in the river. This was salt marsh they were trudging through. It could take a week to transport a ship down to the mouth to get out to sea. This is what we call the no gains section in Pembroke, where it's especially windy. So those boats built up at Brickkiln Shipyard, they would have taken a long time to get downstream. Here's an old map when it was the North River by Hummerock, and I tilted it sideways, sorry, because just so North River was the right side up. So when the ships got to Marshfield, just upstream of the Old Mouth, which we'll talk about in a minute, they were rigged with masts and prepared to officially launch, most often in that red circle at White's Ferry Shipyard. The shipbuilding industry reached its peak between 1799 and 1804. In those 5 years, 115 vessels were launched. 115 vessels were dragged down the North River by men with ropes. After that, as I said before, there weren't a lot of trees left. The railroads weren't in place yet, so we couldn't easily bring lumber in from elsewhere. And there was a sandbar at the mouth of the river that made it harder to get things in and out in general. So the shipbuilding industry faded at that time. Soon after that, the decline of the shipbuilding led to the beginning of the pleasure boating era. The North River Boat Club was formed in 1893 with a clubhouse just to the east of the Bridge Street Bridge, or the Union Street Bridge. As I mentioned before, one of the other challenges to getting these ships down the river was rocks in the river. The ship pilots, building these giant ships, managed it. They got around these obstacles. Early motorboaters, not so much. Instead, they struggled. So around 1910, 1912, some of the towns got together to cooperate in a rock removal project. They brought in a floating crane, and a diver would go down and put chains around the rocks, and they'd drag them over to the edges of the river. You can still see them. If you look across from the Norris Reservation toward Marshfield, there's all these big rocks lining the river. Probably the ones that were dragged out. After they got those rocks out of there, power boating really gained some momentum. This is not a power boat. It's the steamship known as the Portland. I'm sure many of you know one of the biggest events by far to happen on the North River happened on November 26th and 27th, 1898, when a nor'easter known as the Portland Gale struck the coast. The storm was named for this ship, the Portland, which wrecked off the coast with 192 fatalities. The storm itself caused 150 different shipwrecks. They didn't have weather forecasting like we have today, not in the same ways. It actually cut a new mouth for the North River. So this is a 1870 map, and you can see at the top, that yellow arrow, there's a skinny little line it's pointing to. That skinny line is today's North River mouth. Back then, it was a narrow beach connecting Third Cliff and Scituate to Fourth Cliff and Scituate. This pink thing is Hummerock. And this green arrow is where the mouth of the river was back then. So you built a ship up here, and then you dragged it not to there, but down here to the pink part where it got rigged. And then maybe you were lucky and you could sail it out from there. Maybe you dragged it some more. And there's a sandbar here. And eventually it would go out to sea. It was arduous. Has anybody ever wondered why Hammerock is part of Scituate, not Marshfield, while it's connected to Marshfield? This is why. Because it used to be connected to Scituate between 3rd and 4th Cliff. This is Wrexham Beach now in Marshfield, and you can walk that way, but you can't walk across where that yellow arrow is. So the storm, the Portland Gale, caused a tidal wave in the river, and up where that yellow arrow is, washed over the beach from the riverside to the ocean side and wiped out the beach, creating a new mouth for the river. That's what it looks like today up there. You can see that the old mouth got closed off down here. It took a couple years, so they had these boat cruises that would go around Hammerock all the way around because it was an island for a couple of years. In one mouth, out the other one. This new mouth would have been a welcome change for the shipbuilders, cutting down the route significantly, but it happened about 100 years too late. Sigh. There actually had been clandestine attempts to dig through the beach between 3rd and 4th Cliffs. They would get out there and dig these channels, but they never took. You got to wonder if because they did that, it weakened the beach, and so when this happened, it was more likely to stick. Here we have a storm in the North River mouth. It's grown exponentially in size over time. If you're boating here, you want to use extreme caution. I wouldn't go out there. No thanks. Here it is on a calmer day. Isn't this beautiful? This is courtesy of Carl Swenson. So we're looking south here from Scituate to Marshfield. Can you look at the marshes there? They're just so extensive. It's impressive. After the industrial decline of the 1800s and before the housing boom of the post-World War II era, it was relatively quiet on the North River. The forests were given a chance to regenerate. After the Portland Gale, with the new mouth now 3 miles closer to the ocean, the influence of the tides was felt much more intensely upstream. It actually raised the water level in the North River by a foot. Normally it would take 100 years for that to happen. It happened because of one storm. This put an end to salt haying. It significantly changed what could grow in the salt marshes in general because there was a greater influx of salt water coming up. It affected farming for the same reasons. Cedar trees, which were prevalent, began to die off as well. Cedar takes a really long time to decompose, so you can still see a lot of dead cedars in the marshes. This is up in Pembroke. Things really began to shift on the South Shore and on the North River when Route 3 was completed. With Route 3 came a development boom with lots more houses and lots more roads. And by the 60s, things were decidedly less serene. So there was a wastewater treatment plant in Abington that discharged to a tributary of the Indian Head River. There were proposals to build wastewater treatment plants in Scituate and Rockland, both of which would be designed to discharge into the rivers. The red dot there is where the actual Scituate wastewater treatment plant is today. A local chapter of the Isaac Walton League was founded specifically to fight back. They wanted to educate the public about these environmental threats posed by these plants. As I think Dan mentioned before, the Battle of the North River, which was led by longtime nature educator and professor Captain Bill Vinell of Norwell, succeeded in spreading awareness. Fortunately, 2 Wetlands Protection Acts, the Jones Act and the Hatch Act, were passed in Massachusetts in 63 and 65. So that helped a lot. The treatment plants were still built, but there were severe limits on what they could actually discharge into the rivers. Since the 1970s, perspectives on the environment have shifted around here. Culturally, we are increasingly appreciating rivers and marshes for flood protection, wildlife habitat, and their beauty, and not as sewers. The North and South Rivers Watershed Association was founded in 1970. It's a year older than me. It was founded thanks in large part to Bill Vinell's advocacy, but also because of Jean Foley. She observed that bird populations on the driftway Driftway Conservation Park in Scituate were changing. And she wondered if it was those condos they were building over there or that treatment plant that they were building over there that might have been contributing to the changes. She contacted the town. The town didn't respond. So she took matters into her own hands, gathered up some local friends that were also concerned about these changes, and they started to talk about what could they do to fight back and better preserve our rivers. Thus, the North and South Rivers Watershed Association was born. 2 years later, in 1972, the National Clean Water Act went into effect. It restores and maintains the integrity of water, improves wastewater treatment, and protects wetlands. Why are we looking at Fenway Franks, you may wonder? This prompted the closure of a colonial meat plant on a tributary to the North River in Rockland, and also the wastewater treatment plant in Abington. They also succeeded in getting the North and South Rivers designated as a National Natural Landmark. This is U.S. Department of the Interior. This is the National Parks people. 1975, these rivers were designated a National Natural Landmark. We got the plaque in 2015, I think. But okay. These rivers were designated, well, the North River was designated the state's first scenic and protected river by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Management in 1979. That's good too. That brought us the North River Commission. Thank you, North River Commission. So all that accomplished, they turned to water quality. By 1988, the shellfish beds on the North and South Rivers were permanently closed because of pollution. Consistently high pollution. In 1989, an outfall pipe at the Scituate wastewater treatment plant was identified as a major source of this pollution, and NSRWA began its campaign to plug the pipe. We began our River Watch sampling program, monitoring water quality at numerous points within the shellfishing area. This gentleman is in the room tonight, this is Stan Jones, the first executive director of the NSRWA. We went clamming in January, because we're crazy, apparently. Thank you. Thanks to improved water quality, in 1996, 194 acres of shellfish beds were reopened on the North River on a seasonal basis. So you can only go from December to May, so winter clamming is a thing we do. This is because the water quality in the summer is not clean. It's just not good enough. But they've been able to expand the clamming area to 292 acres as they've identified pollution sources and mitigated them. Pollution sources can be not just treatment plants, it can be septic systems that aren't working right. They can be storm drains that are dumping things from the streets into the rivers and other things as well. Sometimes it's just too many ducks. In 2000, it was another good year. The Scituate treatment plant was updated. Yay! The pipe was plugged. Marshfield approved its town sewer line, and both changes reduced pollution greatly in the rivers. So in 2011, 313 acres of shellfish beds were opened on the South River for the first time in 20 years. Moving on to dam removals a little bit more. We're actually investigating dam removals on the Indian Head River and the South River right now. Some of the challenges we've identified, and we're actively working to make better, are that our rivers are too fragmented. So too many dams, they're obsolete, we don't need them. Poor water quality prevents us from shellfishing for 5 months of the year, the good summer months. 75% of the town's water supplies are at their limits, and they're draining our rivers dry. When we have a drought, there's water bans, it's also draining a lot of water out of the rivers, out of the groundwater. Climate change is leaving humans and animals and everything else vulnerable, and the governments are strained for resources how to deal with this stuff. So we're here because we want to have healthy rivers, we want to educate, we want to engage. Thank you for coming to learn with me tonight. One of the ways we're addressing this stuff is just by finding all sorts of ways to work with you, to tell you more about our rivers, because we think the more you know about them and the more you experience them, the more you're going to love them and want to protect them. We have an amazing website that I invite you to check out, nsrwa.org. The tricky part is remembering the order of the consonants there. This is the Get Outdoors section of our website. This is my favorite part, not because I built it. Say you want to go for a walk. say you want to go for a walk in Norwell, but you don't know where you can go. Maybe you're sick of going to the Norris Reservation. You can click on that hiking box. It will give you way too many listings still of all the places you can hike on the South Shore, but then you can choose a town. It'll narrow it down to, say, 25 in Norwell, and then you can read those listings and figure out which one you want to go to. It provides parking information, the actual address, photos, whether or not you can bring your dog, the length of the trails, trail maps if they're available, history, all sorts of good stuff. You could spend all day checking this out. I recommend that you do. We have 550 listings, and we keep adding more. So we want to make it easy for you to get out there and fish, paddle, boat, have a picnic, just sit and enjoy the view. So this is just the middle section. There's boxes above and below in alphabetical order with other things you can choose. Our goal is healthy rivers. I'm going to take questions in a second. I just want to direct your attention to the pile of green bags in the back of the room. Those are our swag bags. They are free if you wish to take one. They have really cool maps of the North and South Rivers in them and some other great information. Also back there, there's a clipboard where you can sign up for our e-news, which is an email you get just twice a month that gives you all the latest juicy details on what we're working on and walks we're having and things that are happening on the rivers, like the dam removal that's going to happen on the South River really soon. There's also a lot of info about volunteer opportunities in there in case you want to find a way to do it. We've got volunteer opportunities for every skill set. So if you have a skill, we probably have a volunteer job that you could help us with. So that's a lot of me talking. Any questions? Thank you. Awesome question.